Olá a todos, meu nome é Ariadne Guimarães, eu trabalho como Relações Institucionais da Casa Hunter e mais uma vez nós estamos juntos para mais uma edição do Fórum de Asma Grave, uma iniciativa da Asbag junto com a Casa Hunter. E a cada ano nós tentamos aí trazer novos especialistas, novos temas que enriqueçam, né, esse trabalho. Hoje nós contamos com uma convidada mais do que especial. Welcome, Professor Vanessa McDonald. A real
Thank you.
pleasure to have you here talking with us. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us just a little about your relation with pulmonary diseases?
Yeah, okay. Well, lovely to be here, and thanks for the invitation to have this discussion. So, I'm a professor of respiratory nursing, and I am also the director of the Centre of Research Excellence in Treatable Traits. That's been a very relevant area of research for me and a particular research interest. So I've been working with patients with respiratory disease for 30 years now, starting my career in a respiratory inpatient ward, and then specialising in respiratory nurse consultancy, particularly with patients with obstructive airway diseases such as asthma, severe asthma, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And then later, probably midway through my career, I embarked on a PhD and now have a real research focus in the work that I do.
Such a large way, such a large story treating this. So you are a specialist on asthma, COPD, severe asthmas, and other conditions. And you are responsible for a center dedicated to severe asthma indeed. So would you please share with us the status of your actual research in severe asthma? And are there new evidences about this treatment?
Yeah. So the work that we do in severe asthma is around personalizing management, and not necessarily only looking at inflammatory phenotypes for the pharmacological treatment of asthma, but also looking at behaviours, risk factors, and comorbidities which complicate and compound the management of asthma. And our research is focused on very much personalised pharmacological interventions, but also, and equally important, I think, is targeting those treatable traits that continue to cause burden once you've actually managed the asthma as best you can with pharmacological treatment. So, for example, having patients understand the type of asthma that they have and how we can communicate with them so that they understand what eosinophilic asthma means and what the treatments for that means. That they understand the impacts of things like physical inactivity and can look at interventions to try and improve their activity. That they know what kind of things mimic or make their asthma feel worse that may not be asthma and don't respond to asthma treatments. For example, vocal cord dysfunction is a condition that often coexists with asthma and complicates asthma. But it doesn't respond to traditional asthma treatments. So we really need to look at more targeted therapies to those kind of comorbidities and risk factors. Obesity is another area, for example.
Okay, thank you. We had the opportunity to see your interview to NewCastle University, where you spoke about patient groups with severe asthma. And in this interview, you talked about the possibility of these patients do not achieve a full control of the symptoms, even if they use all the possible treatments existent for asthma. So concerning this scenario, could you tell us Which approaches could be complementary to the pharmaceutical treatment recommended today to these patients?
Yeah, so with people with severe asthma, we can treat, say, the dominant things that are causing concern, for example, T2 inflammation in the airway with targeted therapies using biologic therapies. And we can treat the airflow limitation with traditional asthma therapies. But I think, and they're very good, and they've made huge advances to the management of severe asthma and really improved outcomes for patients. But there's no denying that there's a group of patients that even when you treat with these step 5 therapies in terms of GINA, that they continue to experience a burden from their severe asthma. They continue to have attacks of asthma, and they continue to have a quality of life burden. And I think this is where a treatable trait approach is really important, because we can then identify in each individual patient, what is it that's driving that ongoing burden? Is it a different type of inflammation in terms of inflammatory cells, or is it related to comorbidity like obesity, physical inactivity, anxiety and depression, or vocal cord dysfunction, or the many other kind of complications that coexist with severe asthma? So I think it's really important to identify what the individual aspects of that person are, so that we can then target individualized treatments according to those existing traits that remain once you've managed the asthma as best you can with pharmacotherapy.
So let me say, if I understand, we are talking about a very personalized approach. Each patient deserves a special look. Am I wrong?
That's a beautiful way to say it. Yeah. So looking at each individual patient and conducting a multidimensional assessment of that individual, so that we're not treating all patients the same. We're treating patients for the traits that exist in that person. And we can start by understanding what type of inflammatory profile that they might have, and then using targeted therapies for that. We can start with the standard treatments for asthma. But then if we're not, achieving the outcomes that we hope to achieve, and the patient is still impaired, then we need to look at, well, what else is going on, so that we can target the individual and the traits that's going on in that person.
Professor McDonald, which is more challenging points concerning the diagnosis of severe asthma? And related to this subject, could you list some diseases commonly mistaken with severe asthma?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess some of the most common things that mimic or are mistaken for severe asthma are things like COPD. So there's many features of COPD that are similar to those of severe asthma. And sometimes if in adults who are diagnosed with severe asthma later in life, it may be that they're initially diagnosed with COPD, and after a process then find out that it's actually severe asthma. Bronchiectasis is another disease that often overlaps with severe asthma and can also complicate the diagnosis. Vocal cord dysfunction I've mentioned already, or inducible laryngeal obstruction. It's known by either term. That's something that the symptoms mimic severe asthma, and often people might present with an acute episode of vocal cord dysfunction and be mistaken for severe asthma. And that's a problem because they continue to get asthma treatments given to them, which they don't respond to, and the treatment is escalated, which they continually don't respond to. So it might be confused with the severe asthma diagnosis, or importantly, it often coexists with a severe asthma diagnosis. So teasing out the symptoms of vocal cord dysfunction to those of severe asthma can certainly be difficult, to say the least.
And unfortunately, sometimes taking a long time.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing with severe asthma is there are many other kind of coexisting things that make symptoms, that potentially can make symptoms worse. So for example, and in a paper that we published with colleagues in Brazil, led by our colleagues in Brazil, we know that people with severe asthma have other conditions like obesity, anxiety and depression, physical inactivity. And many of these other traits can actually cause symptoms of breathlessness. And, you know, there might be symptoms caused from asthma, but they may also be symptoms caused from these other conditions. And I guess teasing out the symptoms that relate to different kind of aspects of the disease is also a challenge in asthma and diagnosis.
In Brazil, the medical societies actualize their recommendations concerning asthma treatment based on GINA, the Global Initiative for Asthma, with some adaptations for sure to the Brazilian population. Following the Australian recommendations, which is the criteria and the markers usually used to diagnose severe asthma and their phenotypes?
Yeah, so I mean, when looking at a diagnosis of severe asthma, so, you know, once asthma's been diagnosed and confirmed, it's then important to confirm, is this indeed severe asthma as well? And, you know, I talked earlier about some of the things that kind of mimic and complicate the diagnosis of severe asthma. But then we also have kind of these subgroups of difficult to treat asthma and severe refractory asthma. So it's important at this stage then to define, is this severe refractory asthma, or is it difficult to treat asthma? And the difficult to treat asthma might actually respond to treatment should you ensure the patient's actually receiving the appropriate pharmacotherapy and has access to that therapy according to the GINA steps. But also that you have addressed the comorbidities and those complications that mimic asthma and the triggers for asthma as well. And if you've gone through and done all of those things, confirmed that they're on the right treatment, you've addressed comorbidities, you've addressed triggers, and they're still kind of not responding to therapy, then they're likely to fit into that severe refractory group of patients. And in this group of patients, it's highly important that we measure, well, I think it's highly important that we measure biomarkers in all asthma patients. But here particularly, I think we need to understand the phenotype of asthma and in terms of their inflammatory profile. And we have very good tools that allow us to do that. So we have FeNO, fractional exhaled nitric oxide, that allow us to determine if this patient has T2 high asthma. And we have a point of care test that's used in most primary care centres of blood eosinophils that's on a full blood count. And these two markers are really helpful in determining, is this T2 high asthma likely to be eosinophilic, or is this T2 low asthma? And then, you know, then the kind of management would be quite different if you're taking that personalised approach to treatment. But we certainly want to confirm the asthma based on objective spirometric markers and symptoms, and then look at the biomarkers to determine which inflammatory phenotype people will fall into.
The research that you were ahead with Dr. Peter Gibson, Celso Carvalho, Rafael Stelmach, and many other important names, published on the European Respiratory Journey 2020, evidenced that it is possible to identify asthma phenotypes based on extrapulmonary treatable traces. What do you think this study could contribute today on the treatment of these patients? And they await any good news ahead?
So is this in relation to the study we conducted with our colleagues in Brazil? Yeah. So I think that's a really important study, actually. This was a study where we in Australia looked at a severe asthma cohort and characterised them from a multidimensional perspective. And our colleagues in Brazil also did the same with a group of moderate to severe asthma patients. And we combined our patients to then do to describe the characteristics of these patients, and we showed that there's a lot of comorbidities, like what we would expect. But I think the novel findings of this was the hierarchical cluster analysis that we performed based on extrapulmonary traits. And we identified 4 main clusters. And it was the clusters that had the extrapulmonary traits. So the uncontrolled asthma that was combined with physical inactivity, obesity, and anxiety and depression, and sedentary behaviour, that had the greatest risk of hospitalizations, emergency department visits, exacerbations in general. Now, I think these findings are very important because whilst we've got excellent treatments, and over the last number of decades, we've got some really novel therapies that allow us to target treatment with biologic therapies. But we haven't really actually focused on, well, in a patient with more severe asthma, how do we actually address these extrapulmonary comorbidities? And this study showed us how they cluster together. They showed us how those clusters actually then relate to increased risk of severe exacerbations, etc. Now, what we need to think about in terms of treatment is how we actually can target these coexisting traits that continue to cause burden, and perhaps, developing interventions for people with severe asthma that bundle kind of interventions to target things like obesity, inactivity, and anxiety and depression, to try and then actually improve the outcomes and the quality of life of patients with those diseases. And I know that there's been a lot of work being done in Brazil. They've been leading the way in terms of these exercise interventions with nutritional input as well. I think this is a really important area of research to try and improve that ongoing burden for people with severe asthma.
Professor, I can't say how happy we are to talking with you and to having you here and, sharing your thoughts, your research. But would you like to leave a message to the Brazilians that are now listening you?
Yes, well, I understand this is in relation to World Asthma Day. So I think, public health campaign days such as World Asthma Day are really important to bring focus to asthma, and particularly like with people who have ongoing burden from their disease, to think about how we can improve it. We've had some absolutely wonderful collaborations with our colleagues in Brazil, and I'd like to say hello to them and really look forward to continuing working with our colleagues on on continued collaborations in severe asthma, and I hope that everything goes well for World Asthma Day.
In the name of ASBAGI and Casa Hunter, I would like to thank you and all researchers related to Newcastle University. Thank you to help asthma patients and their families to bring new treatments and recommendations on how to deal with chronic, severe, and rare diseases. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Lovely to talk to you. Bye-bye.